Good afternoon. Good to see everybody here. A big welcome. I think you guys are in for a big treat this afternoon. I'm Terry Kramer, faculty director at the Easton Center, and we're very fortunate to have Jeetu Patel here today. I have to give you a 2-second story. I had the good fortune of moderating a fireside chat with Jeetu several months ago at your headquarters in Redwood City. And it was a UCLA alumni event, and it was just incredible. I thought, wow, this guy's got thoughts, insightful thoughts on a whole bunch of areas. So I hope you'll find that to be the case.
I gotta invite you more to my home because they don't think so at all.
We love you here. We love you here. So Jeetu's got a very deep background in enterprise technology. He's the chief product officer at Box. He's been the chief strategy officer at Box. He heads the platform business there. So a lot of experience in kind of the intersection of cloud and artificial intelligence and digital transformations in business. So first of all, a big welcome and good to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a few questions to begin with. I'm going to try and start kind of macro level on a bunch of technology trends, then talk specifically about Box and what Box is doing, and then we'll get to some other questions about the future of work, your advice to MBAs, and we're trialing Slido today. So please, for questions, enter the event code on Slido, and we will endeavor to call on the most popular questions. And you could, thumbs up on whatever questions have already been submitted that you like. So, Jeetu, you see a lot of the world, and you see a lot of interesting innovation, et cetera. If you look across all the areas of innovation, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's diagnostic tools in healthcare, whether it's cybersecurity, et cetera, what are the areas of innovation you're most excited about?
So typically the framework that I usually use is what innovations are going to have the most amount of ripple effect on society. And those are the ones that tend to have the most amount of exciting creativity that can be thought through. Because, for example, if you look at autonomous vehicles, the ripple effect of autonomous vehicles is not just in the fact that you can not drive your car and go from point A to point B. The insurance industry changes, city planning changes, how parking garages will be occupied change, the fact that you're going to have utilization of cars that's going to be from 10% a day to 90% a day is going to have meaningfully different effects to it than otherwise. So like the technologies that have ripple effects tend to be extremely interesting to kind of dissect and look at. Right now, if you look at the ones that are going to have meaningful ripple effects, and I don't know if they'll necessarily all be positive at all times. So I think we have to be careful as society to make sure that we don't just drink the Kool-Aid, but are actually watchful of like how privacy and virality of information spread and disruption of jobs can actually be thought through carefully, because I think if you look at Silicon Valley, we've had a very simplistic narrative that disruption is generally good, and when there's new things that happen, old technologies can will get replaced with new ones, and typically new jobs get created, and the net sum is greater. That might be the case, but when you disrupt a steel worker's job when they're 55 years old, the next job is not being an AI developer. And if you actually don't take care of that part of society and making sure that they get retrained, it actually causes a lot of unrest. And if you think of, then going back to your question, answering the question, I'd say AI is the very obvious one, which is going to have meaningful implications across almost every area. I think cloud is now starting to get into its second inning, where the first inning was everyone just said, okay, this was interesting, and now it's a matter of people are saying it's not a matter of if I'm going to move to the cloud, it's a matter of when I move to the cloud and what workloads I'm going to move in there with. I think if you look at mobile, it's probably in its third inning, where you had the first one was the Nokias of the world. I heard you guys did a case study on Nokia.
Just did that case today, the rise and fall of Nokia.
Rise and fall of Nokia. Yeah. The second one was smartphones. Now I think you're seeing a very interesting kind of dynamic with phones as well, with voice and with AI, tied to phones and all of that. So Mobile is pretty interesting. I'd say blockchain's one that's going to have a meaningful implication to society, especially for the underserved and unbanked population in the world. If you look at AR and VR, I think they're two very different ones. I think AR has more exciting possibilities than VR, but both of them are pretty exciting in their own right. So those are just some off the top of my head that I would think are going to have not just a meaningful impact to society, but the ripple effects in other industries are going to be pretty profound.
Good. And Jeetu, let's drill down more on data. There's been a lot written that says data is the new oil.
Yeah.
And if you look at where the value is greatest, number one, where does data exist? Because we kind of assume it exists, it can be analyzed, et cetera. But if you look across the broad patch, where do you feel like there's sufficient data to do some great stuff? And then number two, what are those great things that are out there?
I don't think in most cases we have the problem of not having enough data right now, and that's actually changed quite a bit recently. I think if we think about what humans are going to have to get really good at in this age, it's that you have to get much better at judgment and decision making with the data that you have so that you can make decisions in a more effective manner. And Jeff Bezos has this great line, which is, make sure you judge people based on how often are they right, not just how often are they decisive, but how often have those decisions actually turned out to be something that's been the right call. And I think that's pretty important with data, that you can take data, you can ingest it, you can infer from it, but then at some point in time there's a human judgment that might need to get made, and when that human judgment gets made, it's the right judgment. And I think that's the thing that society will have to get better at over time, because so far the judgments have been made based on gut instinct. Then there was a phase where data was everything and people blindly were listening to data. And I think in most cases, in at least business that I've been in, you always have imperfect amounts of data, but you have too much data. So you have to be able to make the right judgment with 70% of the data. And you have to feel comfortable that at 70% of the amount of knowledge that you need, you can make the right call. Because if you wait for 100% of the data, you'll actually be too late for making the call, and it'll be an irrelevant call by the time you make it. So I think that aspect of getting good at human judgment, I think will be more important as we weave ourselves into the data aspect. And then you have to think about, okay, so what's going to get me the right level of visibility so I can make the right call, and how are you going to think about that data architecture at the beginning rather than at the end? And that might be another thing to think through. So we think about that very deeply in software. What's the metric for success for a particular piece of software? And how are we going to know whether or not we're succeeding? And what data do we need to collect from an instrumentation perspective up front to know what winning looks like for that particular feature? So in Jeetu, you see a lot of industries at Box that are your customers. If you were to kind of look and say, where's adoption going to happen first? What sectors, which ones might it happen later in? Whether it's a cultural issue that in some businesses the feeling that intuition is better than data, whether it's because of the organizational environment that it's hard to kind of get alignment, whether it's something else. If you just kind of look at industries, where do you think we're going to see some of the earliest best use cases, and which ones might take a little bit longer? Best use cases of technology?
Use of data.
Use of data.
Predictive, artificial intelligence, et cetera.
Got it. I'd say like highly regulated industries will have a lot of incentive inherently baked in to go out and use data more, because it becomes a great insurance policy as well. So like financial services, it was fascinating. Financial services for the longest time was the slowest adopter of our technology for content management. And then all of a sudden over the past 3 years, like the things that they're doing, like literally almost no other industry is doing. It's actually fascinating to see how they've kind of shot up. So that's one which is very interesting. Any industry which is going to see a lot of full-on frontal disruption, you're going to start seeing that they're going to get their act together, because if they don't, they won't be around. And so I think that there's only two kinds of companies, I think, today in the world. There's ones that are getting disrupted, ones that are going to be going on the offensive and disrupting someone else. And the way to think of that is any industry that's facing a pretty heavy attack, that just necessity is a mother of invention, and you're actually just going to get better at it. So that would be the one that I'd look at. I think retail is a great one. I think government, believe it or not, is one where there's pretty sophisticated use of data in government, especially in some of the security agencies and all that. Like it's pretty remarkable to see what some of those possibilities are. I'd say manufacturing is one where you're starting to see a lot of kind of efficiency in supply chain, especially in high-tech kind of manufacturing. The ones which have not been as movie studios is one which is amazing. Like the amount of AI that's being used, and even CGI that's being used on that side has been going on for a while. But I think you're starting to see more AI being used in movie studios as well, especially in the determination of what class of content is going to have what kind of reaction with the audience. Like I think Netflix is probably one of the best examples on how much precision-based data they have on knowing exactly what show is going to apply to what cohort of their kind of user base, and how are they going to go out and build it so that you can actually have a certain set of results. And they're remarkably accurate in prediction compared to reality.
Yeah, and will disrupt the studios and others, or?
Yeah, I mean, they already have to some degree, I think. Like if you look at, there's, the interesting part about companies like Netflix is what they've done more than anything else that we should take a lesson from, is they expanded the TAM. And here's the biggest flaw that I see in business that happens. People look at the total addressable market as this kind of starting point of creating innovation. And the reality is by the time you have a TAM, it's too late, right? If you want to make sure that you've actually gone out and got after markets that you're creating, and what Netflix did was, rather than just saying, I'm going to go after an existing market and displace it, they've now created an appetite for people who have Prime Video still pay for Netflix, and they also pay for Hulu, and they also pay for something else. And before you know it, you've got 3 or 4 or 5 subscription services at $10 to $14 a piece that people are paying for because the content itself is valuable. So I do believe what they've done is they've shifted the conversation.
Yep, makes sense. Let me ask you on the competition front now, because we talked a lot about market and adoption, et cetera. And I think we've talked about this briefly, but the article from McKinsey on superstars. Basically, the argument says that there are going to be superstar nations, there are going to be superstar companies, and there are going to be superstar individuals. People that have scale, access to digital and the internet, et cetera, and they're going to have disproportionate gains. And you're going to have a lot of nations, companies, and individuals that don't. Do you buy into that, and is that kind of the way things you think are going to be going?
Here's a big, if you looked at the world 10 years ago and now, in the competitive landscape, what's changed? I think the bigger companies have gotten far more capable of getting adept at fending off disruption than the last era. Compare a company like HP during its heyday to Google today, or to Amazon today. And arguably Amazon is probably faster at innovating compared to any other startup that might be out there, because of the way in which they've structured the organization, the way in which they've distributed control, the way in which they've gone out and made sure that they can fund ideas for to what period of time. So I do believe that there's this race that's had between a startup and a large company, which is you as a startup have to get to distribution before your competitor, who is the large incumbent, gets to product. Right? Like you have to get to scale distribution before your company gets to product. That is the cardinal rule that you have to have. Because if you take too long to get to distribution, chances are the larger companies are going to get to product pretty fast. Now, in the past, what used to happen was there was so much inefficiency in the model that the large companies took a really long time to get to product. So you had all this time to get to distribution. Today, large companies can look at something, replicate it pretty fast, and you need to make sure that when you get to distribution, you get to scale it really, really fast. Otherwise, someone's going to come in and they can replicate it. And that, I think, is probably the biggest shift that's happened. And from that perspective, I haven't read that article, but what do they call it?
McKinsey superstars.
Superstars. So if you think about the Amazons, the Googles, you can put Apple over there, but even there's probably like 10, 12 large companies at scale that are now doing, billions of dollars, if not tens of billions in revenues. I think there's a remarkable thing that they've all collectively learned, which is they still operate with autonomy in small teams and then they just scale the number of teams that they have. But every single small team has a level of decision-making authority that they can just move fast with, where they don't have to go up the chain and down the chain from a bureaucracy perspective. And that agility is what gives you the advantage of capital, advantage of reach, but also the advantage of very rapid innovation cycles.
Good, good. Let me ask you another category. Again, these are macro, and we're going to get to box in just a second.
Is this useful, by the way, for everyone? Or, yeah, okay, cool.
They either look excited or scared or both, but either of those are good.
It's hard to read this crowd, so.
Yes, business models, how people are going to be making money. If you look at, we just did a case on the voice wars about Siri, Viv, Google Home against traditional methods of accessing the internet. Basic argument, people are going to access the internet via voice, etc. Facebook just came out, and it looks like in response to a lot of regulatory issues, saying they're going to try and monetize in payments. It looks like an early shift away from advertising.
Yeah.
Give us your thoughts about monetization. Are we seeing kind of the beginning of a whole different way that a lot of the successful tech companies are going to make money, or are these just kind of little one-off things happening?
So my macro comment on business models is, if you look today and you compare today to like 50 years ago, and you look at the S&P 500 and the average lifespan of a company and the S&P 500 like 50 or 75 years ago, it used to be about 50 or 75 years. Today it's 10 to 15 years. And the reason for that is because your half-life of companies and business models is actually shrinking quite a bit. And I actually think it's about 7 to 10 years that a business model has as shelf life. And then every 7 to 10 years, you as a company have a responsibility to completely rethink your business model. It's not that you, at 10 years, you say, now I'm going to start thinking of my business model. Literally, the dynamics of the market will force you to, because your business model will shift every 7 to 10 years, right? And while it's in its heyday, you might think it's going to go on forever, but believe me, it won't. And so if you look at Netflix as a classic example again, they're in the third iteration of their business model. They started with mailing DVDs, then they went into going out and streaming content, and now they're in original content, production. And in original content production, they're spending billions of dollars at this point in time in going out and doing original content production, right? So that's the third iteration of the business model, and they've roughly been around 20, 21 years, something like that. So like every 7 years, they've actually had a change. Each subsequent change in the business model almost obliterated the previous one. So, you start to see most of the profit pool shift, most of the revenue shift over time. So then you say, okay, so how is the business model going to shift? There is some meaningful conflicts of interest in certain business models when it pertains to privacy and all of that, that we all, let me just make one point very clear. I think there's a very specific narrative that sometimes gets created that, big companies and tech companies are evil. And I don't believe that's the case at all. I don't think most of these people, I know a lot of them personally, when they started these businesses, didn't start them saying, I'm going to, Dr. Evil, go dominate the world, and I'm going to take over the world. That's not the way they did it. They actually had a very well-intended, kind of perspective in mind, which is there's a value that I'm going to create, and that value is going to be disproportionate to the incumbent value that's being created, as a result of which I'm going to see a shift in market share that comes towards me. I believe every single company that has succeeded has had that starting position that they've started with. What happens though, when you get to scale, most of those people that have gotten to insane levels of scale, I can guarantee you, not a single one of them anticipated that level of scale when they started, right? But when you get to that scale, sometimes what ends up happening is unintended consequences occur. And I think we are seeing some of that unintended consequence with things like the advertising business model and how that might actually be at odds with the privacy of the consumer. And we need to make sure that when that happens, there's going to be a level of regulation in tech that'll just be inevitable. It will happen. Tech will be regulated over time. It needs to be, regulated to the right level rather than getting over-regulated, but it will be regulated over time because the consequences of tech not being regulated are actually pretty profound, right? And we've seen some of that where there's questions of it ending democracy, if your privacy being eroded. And privacy being eroded for you and me right now might be, oh my goodness, this person's having an affair and the camera took their picture at the toll booth and that actually invaded their privacy. But we have a customer, Oxfam, they're a not-for-profit kind of company, and they deploy resources in these troubled parts of the world when there's an emergency that's going on. And the lady who's the executive sponsor at Oxfam for Box, we had a customer advisory board meeting, and she said, Jeetu, I don't think most people understand that when you violate privacy in a developed world, it might hurt someone's feelings. It might actually give some data to someone, but when we violate privacy in an area where genocide is occurring, people die. So it is not just a matter of you have to make sure that you build an infrastructure so that, people's privacy is maintained for all the reasons that are first world problems, but it's there's literally life and death differential when you actually have an infrastructure that does not maintain privacy. And you want to look at business models where the conflict of interest doesn't become so inherent that you then have to make someone have a decision point that's made based on, do I make revenue or do I take care of my user? Because when that kind of choice comes in, at some point in time, someone is going to make the wrong choice, right? And so you want to make sure that you're actually veering more to business models where the conflict of interest does not exist as much. And I feel like every business has a conflict of interest to some degree, but you want to make sure that that gets reduced more and more. And specifically in the areas of privacy, you'll start seeing that the advertising business model will have a lot of tension over time.
Let me ask actually a couple
Does that answer your question?
It sure does, and it's already the source of a lot of questions that have come in, so I'm going to go ahead and ask.
Sure.
There's already 20 questions that have come in on the role of data and who owns data. So one of them is, since data is playing a big role in upcoming innovations, what's your view on monetization of data? Who owns the data? The customer or the company? So the idea about, at some point should there be a democratization of data, and there's a platform that people sell their data to, et cetera. What's your view on data as a new oil or treated as a scarce commodity? Should data be democratized, and if so, in what cases?
Let me start with who owns the data, because we, in our business, I'll talk about Box and I'll talk in general. In our business, it's very important that there's extreme level of clarity on who owns the data. And we are a content management company that provides an infrastructure and a set of applications so that organizations can manage their intellectual property and content more effectively and collaborate with it and share it and make sure it participates in workflows and secured and comply with the government regulations and all of those pieces. But it is an indisputable truth in our case that the customer owns the data and we are mere custodians of that data. We do not care to own the data. We don't actually ever build something with the assumption that we own the data. We don't want to monetize the data in any way. We want to make sure that our customer unmistakably is the singular owner of data, and we are just mere custodians that are making sure that when they choose to extract more value out of that data, that they can with our platform, only when they choose to. And if they choose not to, then they should not have to do it. And defaults actually really matter in that case, in the system's defaults that you set in the system, because sometimes if you actually set the wrong defaults, you'll make the wrong assumptions about customers. And so we spend a lot of energy in figuring out defaults where the customer actually gets the choice to turn something on rather than turn something off. Does that make sense? And so in our business, it is actually the difference between survival and failure on having that wrong, and we feel like the customer unmistakably owns the data. In other business models, there might be business models where customer might not own the data if they have so given the right for someone else to own the data. I think it's a very tricky situation to get into, because what ends up happening is you get this terms of service legal agreement that not literally a single person that has agreed to that has never read that agreement, right? And so you get this fine print, there's an I agree clause, and now they've gotten cute and they've said until you scroll all the way down, the I agree doesn't become blue, so you can click it. But that's just bullshit. No one goes all the way down and reads it. So the reality is you need to make sure, like Steve Jobs had a really good piece, which was, in order to make sure that you're custodians of the customer's privacy, you want to make sure that when their data is being used someplace else, you tell them in plain and simple English that it's going to be used someplace else in a way that they can say yes or no, and ask them again and again and again, because it's okay to annoy them, but it's not okay to violate their trust. So, just make sure that that happens. And so whenever there's a conflict of interest in the business, you got to make sure that that's actually being thought through in mind.
Jeetu, what about in companies, Google, Facebook, that
Yeah.
are squarely advertising-based businesses?
Yeah.
In terms of who owns the data, do you think over time they're going to have to kind of relinquish the ownership and relinquish the free offering and go to a paid model to?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the advertising business, but I'll tell you this, that typically there's a difference between someone saying, I am going to sell, Jeetu Patel is a 48-year-old man who has an 8-year-old daughter that lives in the Bay Area, to someone else, versus I'm going to actually make sure that when someone wants to market to a group of people that have a certain set of characteristics, you will be in that group of people that get marketed to. I think they're very different things, right? And I think the advertising industry sometimes gets harshly penalized, and it's okay to get harshly penalized because they actually have accumulated so much power that it's okay for them to be held to a higher standard. But they get harshly penalized in the fact that they're selling data, when in fact they're not selling data, they're selling patterns, right? And I think there's a difference between selling data and selling patterns. So if you asked Google or Facebook, I don't think they would say that we actually sell data and give it to someone else. It just so happens that they're selling patterns. Now the challenge that happens is when you don't secure that data effectively and then someone can hack into the system in pretty easy terms, that's pretty irresponsible. And you got to make sure that that's actually being done in a very, very kind of conscious way. But I think it's a very tricky subject, and I don't think there's an easy answer to this stuff. Like, should advertising as an industry completely go away? No, that would be bad for the consumer. Consumers get a lot of their intelligence from advertising, and personalized targeted advertising in some cases can be good for the consumer. It just has to be done when the consumer wants it to happen to them, not something that they actually just get as a byproduct for them using a free product. Yep. That's the point where people actually get upset, and that's the thing that you have to actually measure for.
Makes sense. Let's now switch to Box specifically. Yep. Tell us the current state of affairs, offerings, future areas of innovation, and know that one of the questions immediately that's come up is how are you going to differentiate yourself? When you look at Google and people are using data with cloud-based solutions and all that, how do you stand apart?
There's a piece of trivia I'll let everyone know. So we founded the company 14 years ago. In the first year, there were VCs. I wasn't there at the time, but people told Aaron, you know what? Microsoft's going to kill you in this business. Then came the second year, and they got a little bit more successful. The people said, you know what? Microsoft's going to kill you in the business. 10 years later, they went public. They said, you know what? Microsoft's going to kill you in the business. We're now a $700 million company. Even today, people are like, Microsoft's going to kill you in this business. But the reality is there is always room when people stay ahead of competition and innovate. Microsoft can't kill us in the business. You know when that would happen? When we stop innovating. If we don't stop innovating, I think we'll always, kind of stay ahead. So just to give you kind of a quick profile of the company, we are a $700 million company. The category that we've created is cloud content management. We have the privilege of serving about 92,000 customers actually at this point in time, and about 65 million users. Right, and so they're using our service. In fact, I met a lot of the alumni. Steve's sitting right over here from Capital Group. There's a few alumni that were there, and it's always very gratifying when you sit with a group of people and they say, "Oh yeah, and we're a customer of Box," and it's like it just makes you feel great because there's millions and millions of people around the world that are using it. If you think about where Box is today, I think the way that people engage with content will change so materially in the next 5 years compared to the past 25. And it's because there's a few things that have happened. One is because the content, it's kind of like there's these mega trends that have happened, and we have this kind of rule in our business, which is try to spot the mega trends early on so that you can use them as a tailwind in your business that can propel you forward, right? And so the mega trends in our business, what started were cloud. People were moving the data to the cloud. We said, okay, we're going to be a system that was built on the cloud. That was the first megatrend. Second megatrend was mobile. You said, okay, people can access the data from any device at any time from anywhere. And that actually had a huge amount of freedom that people started experiencing, because now you could have literally terabytes and terabytes of content that people had available to them on their phone that they could just click on and just open up and do something with and collaborate. So I flew over here today. I have two devices with me, my iPad and my phone. I didn't bring my PC with me. And the reason I brought my iPad is because I've got the stylus and I like writing, because it actually creates a different energy when you write rather than type when you're talking to someone, because there's a screen in the middle, so I actually handwrite stuff. But it's something that if I didn't have my iPad, if I just had my phone, like my business wouldn't slow down any. If I had to get any workflows approved, if I had certain things to get done, it would happen, kind of seamlessly. So the second big megatrend that happened was mobile, and the third one that we're starting to see happen now is AI. And with that, what you can start to see is over time, this will be so powerful, because we now have, it's a very interesting business we're in, because our infrastructure capacity 10x's every 3.5 years. Think about that. Like, we have, our data doubles in our data center every 12 to 14 months, but our infrastructure 10x's every 3.5 years. And so we have this very interesting opportunity where it's like, wow, you got all this data, but it's one of the only bizarre industries where the more you use a system like Box, the harder it gets to use, because the more data you put into it, then it's harder to find it. And so our job is to make sure that it's very counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. It should not be the way that things should work. We should actually make it easier the more people use it. And so for doing that, we actually have to make sure that you classify and tag data more intelligently. And now with AI, what's starting to happen is you can actually detect some remarkable things. You can look at a picture and detect an object in the picture. Okay, there's a tennis ball. There's a female playing tennis with New Balance shoes with a green background. And I can have a marketing campaign where I want to find all the pictures I have where there's a female playing tennis with green Balance shoes, in a green background, and I'll be able to go out and pull those up, and I don't have to go tag it manually because an AI engine went out and tagged it. I then will also be able to have conversations with my search engine. I could say, okay, tell me when my insurance policy is expiring, and rather than it opening up a document that I have to go to page 47 to figure out, it should just tell me that my insurance policy is expiring on October 15th. And so those are the kind of interactions that you'll see over the course of the next 5-7 years that'll completely change compared to the way that it was in the past, where the file itself might become the record, but the knowledge from the file will get extracted in many different ways, and you'll be able to do things with that in a very meaningful way, and through a conversation that then can get tied to other data from other systems, and it all kind of pulls together in a very meaningful manner. So I think it's a remarkable industry. One last thing, I know it's a long-winded answer, but one last thing I'll kind of tell you. Why is this important? I personally believe that if you look at opportunity in the world, it's very unevenly distributed, right? A company or an individual in Bangladesh does not have the same opportunities as someone in Silicon Valley. It's just unevenly distributed. But human potential is not. It's very evenly distributed. And so if we can go out and fundamentally change the 10 to 12 hours that people operate in their work environment and give them a more free, more collaborative, more transparent, more knowledge-filled experience with the set of tools that we provide, it actually changes humanity. And if you can change humanity that way, it changes culture, it changes prosperity for humans. Like, everything starts to change. And it's a pretty meaningful cause to spend your life on. And I've spent 25 years in this kind of segment. And the reason I've spent 25 years in one area is I do believe that if done right, I'll be able to tell my daughter that, when I was growing up, opportunity was very unevenly distributed. But by the time we were done, honey, any gender, any race, any country, any citizen of any part of the world had exactly the same opportunity that matched exactly the same human potential that everyone had. That actually, I think, is pretty cool to work on.
Yeah, fascinating. On business models, related to what you just said, that every company's got to keep changing their business model every 7 to 10 years. And one of the questions came in is, where is your business model going to change? Is it with that new capability of tagging data and understanding it that will change your model?
Yes, I think our first iteration of the business model is we just wanted something very simply done, which was Aaron and Dylan. Aaron was the CEO, and he's one of the most fascinating human beings I've met. And he was doing an internship at a movie studio over here, and he found it extremely painful to transport a large file from one person to the other, and they had to put it on a USB stick and then go and walk it over to someone and give it to someone else. This is so screwed up. We should do something different. And so he said, how about if we put something in the cloud and people can just go out and get it from the cloud? So that was the first iteration. But he thought he'd do it for consumers. In the first 12 months, he realized he can do that for consumers. He's not going to make a whole lot of money doing it. So he made the first pivot, which was let's move to enterprises, and then spend about the next decade in the enterprise saying, let's build out not just the capabilities around collaboration, content management, but also capabilities around what do we do to make sure that that content is governed and has data privacy associated with it, and compliance and security and anomaly detection, and all of the things that you would need to have from a security and compliance and data protection and data privacy standpoint. We started building those things, right? And that's what we did in the second act. And we penetrated a large number of Fortune 500s and Global 2000 companies and businesses, and like 95,000 customers or 92,000 customers use us. It's a pretty remarkable feat. We're now at the stage where we're saying, okay, how do people use us today? Well, today they use us for storage, but more than storage, they use us for collaboration. They'll actually collaborate with each other with the file, and they'll comment on the file and then share it with someone else. What our most advanced customers and most exciting customers are doing is they're using us to actually manage their workflows within their organizations. So if you've got an approval cycle, or if you've actually got some kind of QBR process and 50 people have to go out and submit content, and you want to see what the auditing and reporting around that is, all of that needs to happen with the workflows needs to get automated. And so that's our third phase, and that is going to be very instructive with AI. And so as you think about it, we have three major kind of pillars of our business with a piece that underlies all of them. One is managing the content, one is collaborating with it, one is automating the business processes, and all of those things have to happen in a secure and compliant way. That's the way we think of it.
Good. And on those offerings, on those three capabilities, which competitors do you worry about the most? One of the questions is, do you worry about a nimble startup moving in this? When you were describing your offer, I was thinking of Microsoft. Why aren't they doing all of this? Who do you worry about the most and why?
Yeah, so the first rule I try to tell people internally is we're going to think a lot about our competitors. We're going to get to know a lot about our competitors. We're going to worry a lot about our competitors, but we're going to obsess about our customers. And don't ever actually lose that balance, because the moment you do that, you'll be chasing someone rather than letting them chase you, right? Now, if you think about which competitors have, we participate in about $45 billion of a market. There's about $23 billion in storage that can get displaced because it's so ineffective, like network file shares and home directories. Like, literally in 2019, no one should be provisioned a home directory when they get into work. Like, you should have a different, more modern way of doing things. We should think everyone should have a Box account. And so that's a huge market. Enterprise file sync and share. So in that market, we compete with NetApp and EMC and all of those folks. In the file sync and share market, we would compete with OneDrive on the enterprise segment, and then on the mid-market and lower end of the segments, we compete with Google Drive or Dropbox. Then we go into the content management market. We compete with companies like Documentum and OpenText and FileNet, but we also compete with companies like SharePoint, which have been there. And then there's custom applications that are getting built where people use us as a platform and embed us into different applications, where you're competing with people just building their own versus going out and having a microservice from us that actually is a content service. So like those are all the kind of different layers of competitors. The most capable competitor for us is Microsoft. And the beauty about it for us, luckily, is they've got the worst product of all of them. They just happen to have great distribution, right? So they've got a monopoly, and they've taken that monopoly and they've attached everything to the monopoly, and then they sell it. So they've got a fantastic kind of pricing and distribution model. So in the areas where we compete with Microsoft, they're the most capable competitor with the worst product. So that's the advantage. It's also a disadvantage because they also have a monopoly. And the products that we compete with Microsoft are OneDrive and SharePoint. Everything else, we actually partner with them quite a bit. So like we are very, very close partners with Microsoft, with every other team except for OneDrive and SharePoint. OneDrive and SharePoint people hate us. Azure team loves us. because we use their infrastructure to actually put data in them. So like they're like, yeah, we love Box. And the OneDrive team's like, can I actually, take Jeetu out in the parking lot someday? It'd be great. So,
Good, and Microsoft, just stand there for a second there, because they just hit $1 trillion market cap.
Yep.
I understand the point about them having a monopoly, but do you think they'll figure out the product issue and they'll get pretty good in this area?
I think the thing that you have to think about when you're competing with someone is you cannot make the mistake of assuming your competitors are stupid. You have to assume that they're going to be blessed with more resources than you, and they're probably going to make rational decisions, which is like the principle of game theory, right? Your competitors are going to make rational decisions. So then, the question you have to ask yourself is, what are fundamental principles that you want to anchor yourself in that they don't have an incentive to combat, right? And so I'll give you an example, once again, with, it's a really good example. It's not that Netflix is the only example I have. This one is a really good example of Netflix, and I'll give you one with Microsoft and what we're doing with them. So if you think about when Netflix was competing with Blockbuster, Blockbuster didn't have an incentive to compete with Netflix. Why? Because Blockbuster made 50% of their revenues from late fees, and Netflix said we're not going to have late fees. So what it did was it actually did a counter positioning in a way that the incumbent didn't have an incentive to go out and combat it. With Microsoft, we have a similar kind of way that we've actually structured our thing. So our biggest advantage is neutrality, because we believe there are two worlds that are going to be there in the future in the cloud. One world, and this is a good lesson to learn as a case study on how to position yourself when you're going and building your own company or working for someone else as well. One world is everyone buys everything from a single vendor. Step outside of tech for a second and think about everything that you buy every day to survive. Imagine how absurd it would be if you bought everything from one supplier, no one else. Well, not only would it be absurd, because you wouldn't get the best thing from that supplier, it would also be very dangerous from you, but at some point in time, they've got so much power over you, they could do something different. So that's one world. The second world is, you say, okay, there's going to be a world where Slack is going to exist for conversations, Zoom is going to exist for video, Box is going to exist for content management, Salesforce is going to exist for CRM, Marketo is going to exist for marketing automation, Adobe is going to exist for their marketing tools that are going to be part of Marketo and whatever else. NetSuite is going to exist for ERP, and on and on and on and on, right? And all of them are going to work effectively together, and you're going to have a best-of-breed ecosystem. We have actually chosen to say we will be the neutral content store in a best-of-breed ecosystem that goes out and integrates with all of those people deeply. Microsoft can't throw enough money to go solve the problem. They can't solve the problem with 1,000 engineers. Why? Because guess what? They've got Teams that competes with Slack. And they've got Skype that competes with Zoom. Well, kind of. It's a really bad product. They've got Dynamics from that competes with Salesforce. So what ends up happening is they've got a disincentive to go out and create best of breed beyond a certain point, because they actually want to see a world where everything is purchased from one vendor. That creates a level of structural advantage that you can maintain for a long period of time, rather than a feature advantage which can get neutralized by someone just throwing 100 engineers at something. And if there's a problem that can be solved by throwing 1,000 engineers at something, they're smart enough to solve it. When there's a conflict in a business model, they can't solve it, right? And so that's the one that you have to go out and attack. So one of those is those. One of those is extended enterprise, how you go out and compete against the boundaries of beyond the enterprise. So so what we try to do is, when we think of competitive advantages, we think of structural advantages that our competitors don't have an incentive to compete with us against. Those are the ones that you're going to have as a sustained advantage that then creates sustained growth rates for you over time.
You've obviously thought a lot about this.
You think about it.
Yeah, this is great. You should teach technology management. Give it to you from me. So let me ask you a few questions on the future of work.
Yes.
And then talk about some of your leadership advice, because that's where the majority of questions are here. So Kai-Fu Lee, former head of Google in China, was interviewed on 60 Minutes, basically had a forecast that 40% of jobs are going to be lost in the next 15 years. Basically because of artificial intelligence, automation of a lot of activities, diagnostic capabilities, autonomous vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. Do you buy that number, and how concerned are you about notable loss of jobs?
So there's two schools of thought, and I'll give you the answer to that, but I think there's a more important question that should be asked. So first school of thought says the net effect of job loss, I mean, there's going to be more jobs lost than created in the AI revolution. There's another school of thought that says, no, there's just going to be displacement, there's going to be more jobs created. Regardless of whether there's more jobs or less jobs, the fact that you cannot dispute is that jobs will be displaced. And the jobs that will get displaced might not have a logical, kind of place where they go into overnight. So regardless of whether jobs get displaced, if it's going to be more jobs get created or not, it is our responsibility as society to make sure that every job gets displaced, we've actually thought about that human being and thought about that family and how they're getting retrained so that they can actually participate in society in a meaningful way. I think that is a responsibility that we as humans should take on seriously, because it is a very real possibility that there's more jobs displaced, there's more jobs lost than created. And if there's more jobs lost than created, and we actually have a lot of jobs displaced, you could actually get into a very dangerous scenario. So the first thing that I think will become a reality within the next 10 to 15 years is I think basic income is just going to happen. Like, it'll be very hard for basic income not to be a core part of society, because it's very scary to see if someone gets displaced as a coal mining worker, like I said, in their 40s or 50s, and now, all of a sudden that industry is disrupted. Like, literally, what's their next job? Like, society has to go and train them to make sure that they can find the next job. I do believe that in AI, there are certain jobs, there's going to be more jobs right now where the repetitive element will get displaced very rapidly. And I think volume-wise, you might actually see more jobs in the short term get displaced than created in the midterm. In the short term, I think people always overestimate the impact of technology. In the medium term to long term, I do think that this could be pretty profound. We should actually, regardless of what we think is the probable outcome, we should be prepared for our outcome where there's more jobs lost than created, and what would we do as society? And make sure that that's actually being thought through. Otherwise, I think the consequence to everyone is there could be civil unrest, there's a huge set of consequences that could happen over time that I don't think we have all actually completely grokked yet, because by definition, humans can't think exponentially across 18 different dimensions at once. It's just very hard to do. And I don't even think we understand all the aspects of what could go wrong over there. So I think that would be a safe number to go with, and then go with that number and say, so therefore, what should every company be doing? What should every individual be doing as their moral and civic duty to give back to society in a meaningful way?
And Jeetu, who owns the problem at the end of the day? Does government own it, and what's their role? Do business leaders own it? What's their role, and what role do individuals have in that?
I think the answer is yes. I think there's aspects of that problem that government's going to need to own from a policy standpoint. I think there's aspects of the problem that it is actually in the company's incentive to make sure that there's not too much polarity of wealth, because when you've got even distribution of wealth, you actually get more percentage of that wealth back to you as a company. So when there's actually too much concentration of wealth, the amount of percentage of that you can extract and get it back to you as a for-profit company is lower. So in fact, there's a longer-term incentive of there being. Now, I think, let me tell you where I think, I personally feel like there's a thing that goes wrong, is I do think Wall Street looks at things far too tactically in far too short a window of time. When you look only at a quarterly window and you don't actually look at a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year window, I think it's very damaging over a long term for a company's health. And so those companies that can actually make sure that they keep their lens on the long term will actually intrinsically start to gravitate towards doing more in getting the workforce retrained. Those companies that are starting to go and just play the game of Wall Street, I think you'll actually have a harder time with those companies actually taking on responsibility. Individuals, it's a very easy calculus in my mind. By the virtue of the fact that we live in the United States and we lived in a developed world, we have, as Warren Buffett calls it, an ovarian lottery or an immigration lottery. We just happen to be in one of the best parts of the world, and we happen to have the luxuries that most populations can't dream of. We owe it back to society to do more than just do really well, make a really good career of yourself, and make a lot of money. You should probably think of attaching yourself to a longer term purpose that actually makes the better makes a better world as you make all those other things also happen. And so pick a cause where those things are happening, and you should actually, there's a natural incentive, and you feel better. By the way, do it for a selfish cause. It feels better to give back in ways than just have everything hoarded for yourself. That would be my 2 cents.
Good. One last societal question before we get into the career-related issues. One of the items also that Kai-Fu Lee said is that China is eclipsing the U.S. in artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Give us your worldview about where innovation is really happening, value creation. If you were to look at the major geographies of the world, China, the U.S., Europe, and India, where would you place all of them?
I see them as each one has a distinct advantage that the others should learn from. So what is China's superpower advantage? They understand scale better than anyone else. Like it's actually remarkable how well they understand scale. And so when I think about like what advantages that scale can bring to the world of AI, one of the key characteristics of AI and machine learning is it is only useful at massive scale. When you actually have one document that you have to go out and auto tag, I can do it, I can have the machine do it, it's interesting, it's actually novelty, but it's like it doesn't make a difference. But I've got 1 billion documents to do within an hour, and the only limit is compute power, and you've got infinite compute power in the cloud, wow, that actually becomes a game-changing kind of outcome. And so I think China's advantage of scale gives them an advantage in AI that is a pretty profound advantage, and we should not discount that. I think America has a very different advantage, which is creativity and entrepreneurship. And that advantage actually is something that unfortunately is concentrated in pockets within the country and is not evenly distributed in the country. And I think it needs to get distributed. Like I think, by the way, the entitlement and the distortion that's being caused in Silicon Valley is pretty profound, right? Like there's just a level of entitlement. Every 23-year-old I was mentioning to someone earlier in a meeting believes that $1 million is fair compensation, and like why wouldn't we make it? And by 24, they've done 2 years of work experience, they should be CEO. And it's like where I came from, like you waited for a long time to go out and learn a craft, and you have to see the up cycles and down cycles. And I do feel like that level of concentration and scarcity of, you can have a very bad adverse effect if this persists and gets simulated over the long term, which is people can start believing that they're better than what they actually are because scarcity of supply makes them believe they're better because there's a very high demand for what they do. But in fact, all it is you're just a benefactor of scarcity. And so what you need to make sure is that you don't confuse excellence with scarcity. I think like we have a risk on creativity of making sure that actually could happen within the U.S. in some pockets. And so we have to distribute that evenly. I also feel like this is not a zero-sum game. Like I think it's actually a shame in how some of our political leaders have actually created this level of, open trade is a good thing. When someone succeeds in one area, it does not mean you have to fail. In fact, rising tide, rises all boats. So like you actually benefit when the world economy is doing well rather than the world economy is doing poorly. And rather than thinking about like what is I call it the beer economy. When you actually take a friend out to dinner, one time you'll pay, the second time they'll pay. There's people that do that, and it just works out okay. There are other people that say, I had a drink, you didn't have a drink, so I'm going to pay $3 more than you did. And it creates a very punitive kind of relationship dynamic. And second one is like it doesn't really get you ahead. Like you just get petty in the way you think. And I think that beer economy when extrapolated to countries is what we're doing right now. So like we should be a little bit more open in the global prosperity of humans. Like the only border we should be thinking of is that of humanity, not of artificial country borders that we've created. Like I think over time, I hope there's more of a concept of global citizenship. It'll be far more productive for us than the way that we've structured it right now.
And your views on India and Europe in that broader...
So in India, I think the remarkable part about India is that the batch of a population that's going to be in the working world is actually greater than any other part. So that's the distinct advantage that they have, is they've got this amazing group of people in the age bracket between the, 15 to 40 kind of, and what the population bell curve is of the people that are in that age bracket is remarkably high, right, compared to everyone. I don't know the exact stats, but it's super high. And that actually gets them a huge advantage as they move forward. The huge disadvantage, the infrastructure and the corruption in that country actually is just so hard to get things done that's the area that they actually tend to fall back on sometimes. But I think they've made a lot of progress. But I don't think, I think if you look at the GDP growth rates, like China is clearly on a tear, and they're going at a pretty kind of good clip. India is not quite at China's rate, but they actually have a lot of kind of sustained advantages that they're creating. And I do think there's a special secret sauce in America, which is the respect for kind of freedom and creativity and all of that. I grew up in India. I came to America. I drank the Kool-Aid of this country. I think it's one of the best countries in the world. And it's such a privilege to be here, and I hope that we don't fuck it up.
Well said. Well said. So, a couple last questions before we have to stop here. One of the questions came in on the career front. What skills and experiences of yours do you feel enabled you to be the best person to be the chief product officer at Box? What's your secret sauce?
My secret sauce was actually, and I was telling this story to someone earlier. I am. Can I take a little bit of a detour and give a little bit of context? Okay, so this is getting recorded.
Yes.
Fine.
Yeah, everything's recorded, and social media too.
Okay, but I'll say it anyway, but I think it's instructive for this group of people because I think it's important for you folks to understand it. And it'll come across as an odd story for a while. There'll be some uncomfortable moments, but get through it with me.
Yeah.
So my dad was a high stakes con man in India, and he was kind of a tier 1 kind of criminal, taking a lot of money from a lot of people, and as a result, my life at some point in time was in danger because there were people that he had taken money from everyone from a poor farmer to a big corporations, and people had said, get out, get out of the country. It's not safe for you to be here, and I left when I was 19, right, and I came here, and he was a pretty wealthy guy, but I just left everything behind. We hid my mother in an undisclosed location because she could not get a visa to come here. And then, we brought her here. She's 81 now and living with, about half a mile away from me. And, has been in America for like about 20 years. So that kind of happened. And when I came here, the singular kind of objective I had was I had to get my mother here. And I got very fearful of being poor, because I'd seen how difficult it was when poverty gets to you. And like I used to, I used to have $3 a day for food, and it was just a hard time that we went through. And I had to send money to my mom, and she didn't have enough money, and we were just kind of getting through it, and it was a very helpless situation to be in. And so I had this intrinsic hunger to say, I'm just not going to be poor again, and I'm going to actually make sure that I get to a point where I don't have to worry about money and all of that. And so there was a level of fear that motivated me, and there was a level of hunger of making sure that I could take care of me and my mother at the time. And we were, I was the only child, and so I was all she had. And that actually motivated me to a great degree, where there was a time when I realized that if I put my mind to something and break down the problem into its smallest piece parts, there's actually not that many things that I would not be able to learn. So then, all I had to do was get curious about the things that I enjoyed learning the most, and then spend my energy in getting to be world-class at those things. But I knew that because of my desire to actually get out of that mode, and by the way, that creates a lot of other psychological issues. So like I'm still pretty screwed up in the sense that I'm still like, my biggest fear right now, if anyone were to guess, my biggest fear at this stage in my career, which is completely illogical, and Aaron makes fun of me all the time, is for me to stay unemployed. Like, I feel like I would be unemployed, it would be the most devastating thing that happens to me. I wouldn't find a job. And that actually drives me to continue to make sure that there's this mentor that I had that said, Jeetu, always remember dark to dark. You come in before dawn and you leave after dusk, so that you can always, you might not be the smartest guy in the room, but you'll be the hardest working guy in the room. And when that happens, you'll actually do well. So that's what drove me, was hunger and curiosity, right? I've found, in my experience, that when those don't exist, in fact, it's detrimental for people. Now, hunger doesn't need to exist because you had psychotic dad that didn't really work out that well for you, and then so you had to do something different, and that's why you got hungry. Hunger can exist in multiple different forms. In my case, I was blessed enough to actually have that condition happen early on in my life that actually created an intrinsic motivator. But I worry a lot about my daughter, who is the kindest human being on the planet that has very little ambition right now, and she's 8. And but I need to figure out a way to kind of instill ambition in her, because if you don't get hungry and if you're not curious about the world, I think the rest of the stuff is mechanics. But these things are pretty, and then there's a third dimension that I think is pretty important, which is crispness and clarity of communication to the point that you can inspire other people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. I think if you can get those 3 things packaged up, and if you can search for people with those 3 things and surround yourself, you're always the mean average of the 5 people you're around the most. Surround yourself with people that have that. I think you can tend to, you'll beat the averages in life and do pretty well. If you don't, I think that's where, don't be around people that are entitled and not hungry, even if they're really, really smart, because chances are at some point in time, their grit won't take them all the way through. Like the persistence won't exist to take them all the way through.
Wow. What a story. Well, thank you for
Sorry
sharing
for making it awkward for you guys, but it was,
So, very last question. MBAs that are here, they're going to be going out in the workforce, whether it's the summer, it's going to be full-time, et cetera. What practical advice would you give for them to ensure good outcomes?
I'd say, probably, can I give them 2 things?
Sure.
So first one is, there's this guy, Marcus Buckingham. How many of you have heard of him? If you haven't, you should kind of try to read his work. He's a, talks about leadership and all of that, but he's got this kind of thought process, which is, you got to double down. Corporate America has it all wrong. The way that they do performance reviews is they'll sit down with someone in a very awkward setting once every 6 months and tell them how they're doing. They'll say, these are things you're doing well, these are things you're not doing so well. And so go out and focus on the things you're not doing so well, which makes completely no sense, because it makes no sense at all, because like, why would I focus my time on things that I don't actually do well? Like, that is not where I draw my energy from. I draw my energy from things I do well. So what we should be doing is saying, make sure you double down on your strengths and find out what your strengths are and do those really, really well. And don't really focus on things that you don't do well, unless those things that you don't do well are going to become an impediment for your success because you can't function. Right? So for example, if you're a bad communicator, fix that problem. Because there's no job where you're a bad communicator and you're a very successful person. Like, humans have a gift of language. That's how we communicate. Like, you have to communicate with people. So, learn how to communicate. But that's the piece that I think, so Joe Tucci was one of our great leaders at EMC had told me, Jeetu, whenever you go to a job, take a sheet of paper, build 4 columns. Things you love doing that you're great at doing. Things you love doing you're not so good at doing. Things you hate doing that you're great at doing. Things that you hate doing that you suck at doing. Take columns 2 through 4, collapse them because they don't matter. Only focus on column 1, which is things you love doing that you're good at doing, and get to be world class at that. If you can do that and then surround your people where that column for them is columns either 2, 3, or 4, you will actually create a good team around you. And then you folks will be able to do amazing work. So that's the first piece of advice, is double down on your strengths, not on your weaknesses. Unless your weakness is something that is actually going to debilitate you from going out and getting something done, then make sure that you focus and get good enough at that. That's number 1. The second piece I'd say is pick one thing, if you can, that you're going to orient your moral compass around and you orient your kind of energy around and your decision-making framework around. Don't try to pick 15 things. Don't create a spreadsheet and say, these are all the things I want to do and I'm going to put some weighting and probability on that. Just pick one thing and follow that one thing and stick with the problem. The quality of the problem that you pick to solve in your life is going to be directly proportionate to the success of the outcome. So if you pick a quality of problem that's really hard, chances are you're going to be more successful. It's very counterintuitive, but true, because if you pick a really hard problem, you'll get people along with you that are really smart people that want to solve a hard problem. And the quality of people will be directly proportional to the difficulty of the problem, and that will actually increase your odds of success. So pick a really hard problem that is solvable, but takes a lot of work to solve. Focus on that problem for a sustained amount of time, and make sure that in that problem, you are doing the things that are your natural strengths that you draw energy from, and you'll do great things in life.
Wow, well said. So, as a wrap up here, first of all, thank you for your questions. I think they're going to automate the moderator role because you could have taken all these directly. They were great.
I don't think that one is one. I think that's going to stick around after
a little bit. Second of all, we've got a reception in the D atrium, is it? Yeah, D atrium afterwards. Most importantly, Jeetu, you continue to amaze me. I mean, the thoughtfulness and the insights across so many areas, macro trends globally, technology trends, what's going on at Box, career insights, the candor that you shared with us. What an incredible set of learnings. A huge, huge thank you. We have a little gift for you, and I hope you'll come back.
Oh, I'd love to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. You're terrific. That is so, you continue to amaze me. Just wonderful. A number of things.
You know, I give all the credit to the interviewer. It's a quality question.
Not at all. Not at all. So you're going to head to the reception, right, with Heather. I'll be there for a minute, and then I'm going to do the evening class.
Okay.